You thought I would not come, did you? I asked, and for the first time in 3 years, Ethan Blackwood had absolutely nothing to say. The silence between us lasted maybe 2 seconds. It felt longer. Long enough for the piano to keep playing. Long enough for the waiter beside me to glance nervously toward the floor. Long enough for every person at Ethan's table to understand that something had gone wrong with his little joke. I stood at the entrance of Belladonna, the kind of Manhattan restaurant where the glasses were thinner than paper and the candles cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Outside, rain slid down the tall windows, turning the city lights into long streaks of gold and red. Inside, everyone looked polished, expensive, untouchable. And there I was, Claire Bennett, 28 years old, secretary, keeper of calendars, fixer of scheduling disasters. The woman people called nerdy when they thought I could not hear them. Ethan had invited me to dinner that morning. You should come tonight, he had said from behind his enormous desk. It might be good for you to see how the other half lives. A few people in the office had laughed. Not loudly. They were too smart for that. But I heard enough. I always did. So I had looked at him over the top of my glasses and said, "What time?" He had smiled like he had already won. That was his mistake. Ethan Blackwood was 36, wealthy, feared, and accustomed to entering a room as if it belonged to him. Technically, most of them did. His business empire stretched across Manhattan through real estate, private investments, restaurants, and companies with names that never appeared in the same headlines as his. People lowered their voices when they talked about him. I had spent 3 years organizing his meetings and watching powerful men wait outside his office. But I had also spent 3 years learning something else. Men like Ethan rarely looked closely at people they believed were beneath them. That was why I could stand in front of him now, wearing a midnight blue dress I had bought on clearance 6 months earlier and nearly forgotten in the back of my closet, and watch his confidence disappear one careful inch at a time. I was not transformed. I had not become someone else between 9 o'clock that morning and 7:30 that evening. I had simply stopped dressing for everyone else's expectations. "Claire," Ethan finally said. His voice was lower than usual. "You came." I smiled. That was the invitation. Someone at the table cleared his throat. Another woman looked from me to Ethan and back again. I recognized the expression. Confusion. People expected confidence to arrive wearing permission. Mine never did. The maitre d' reached for my coat, and I handed it to him. Then I walked toward the table. Ethan stood. That surprised me more than the invitation had. "You do not have to stand," I told him. "I am still the same person who scheduled your dentist appointment yesterday." A few people laughed. This time, Ethan did not. He pulled out the chair beside him. "I know." I sat down and looked around the table. Crystal glasses, white linen, tiny arrangements of flowers. Every detail chosen to make ordinary people feel as if they had entered somewhere they did not belong. I had spent most of my life in rooms like that, even when I was nowhere near them. Rooms where people decided what I was capable of before I opened my mouth. My fingers rested lightly on the edge of the menu. Across from me, Ethan watched me. Not the way he had that morning. The amusement was gone. In its place was something far more interesting. Uncertainty. The waiter poured water into my glass. I thanked him. Ethan leaned slightly closer. "You seem very comfortable." I looked at him. Should I not be? His eyes held mine. For a moment, the entire restaurant seemed to disappear behind the soft music and the rain. Then I smiled again. "Relax, Mr. Blackwood. You invited me here as a joke. The least I can do is make sure everyone enjoys it." And that was when I saw it. The smallest shift in his expression. Not embarrassment. Not anger. Something more dangerous to a man like Ethan Blackwood. He was beginning to realize that he had never known me at all. The first few minutes were almost funny. Ethan kept waiting for me to become uncomfortable. I could see it in the way he watched me over the rim of his glass. He knew how to command a room. He knew when people were pretending. But he had no idea what to do with someone who simply refused to perform for him. "Claire works in my office," he told the woman across from me. Her name was Victoria Hale, a real estate attorney with a smile so polished it looked expensive. "I know," Victoria said, studying me. Ethan mentioned his secretary. I lifted my water glass. He forgot to mention that I am also the reason he has not missed a meeting in 3 years. The table went quiet for half a second. Then Victoria laughed. Not politely this time. Genuinely. Ethan looked at me. I smiled sweetly. "What?" "It is true. The appetizers arrived." I thanked the waiter. Ethan watched me do that too. It was strange. He had seen me speak to hundreds of people, delivery drivers, board members, hotel managers, investors. Somehow, he had never actually listened. So, Claire, Victoria said, what do you do when you are not keeping Ethan's life organized? I could have given the easy answer. Reading, coffee, staying home, something that would fit neatly inside the version of me they had already invented. Instead, I set down my fork. Mostly research. Research? Ethan asked. I turned toward him. You know, that thing I do when your meetings run late, and you forget I am still in the building. His expression changed again. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. What do you research? Victoria asked. Financial history. Market failures. Old corporate scandals. The boring things. That does not sound boring. Only when nobody loses money. A man named Grant, one of Ethan's investors, leaned back in his chair. You follow markets? I follow patterns. That sounds like something people say when they want to sound smarter than they are. The old Claire might have looked down. She might have laughed softly and let the moment pass. But I had spent too many years making myself smaller so other people could feel comfortable. I looked at Grant. You invested in Harbor West last spring, correct? His smile faded. Yes. Then you probably know the company reported strong growth before the merger. Ethan slowly set down his glass. Grant stared at me. How do you know that? Because the growth was mostly created by selling assets, not by expanding operations. It looked impressive until you separated the numbers. Nobody spoke. The piano continued somewhere behind us. Rain tapped softly against the windows. Grant looked at Ethan. She knows Harbor West? Ethan did not answer immediately. His eyes were on me. Apparently, she does. I took another sip of water. I read the reports. Grant frowned. Those reports were not exactly easy to access. I shrugged. Public filings are public for a reason. Victoria smiled into her wineglass. I like her. Everyone seems to, I said. Except the person who invited me. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly. You are enjoying this. A little. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. You could have told me you knew this much. I met his gaze. You could have asked. That landed harder than I expected. His face became still. For the first time that evening, I wondered if I had gone too far. Then he looked away. Not angrily. Thoughtfully. Grant started talking again, asking me questions about market cycles and corporate restructuring. Victoria joined in. One conversation became another. Somewhere between the second course and the coffee, I stopped feeling like an unexpected guest at Ethan Blackwood's table. I was simply Claire, and apparently, that was enough to make him uncomfortable. When dinner finally ended, the others began gathering their coats. Ethan stood beside me near the entrance. Outside, the rain had slowed to a silver mist. You surprised me tonight, he said. I looked up at him. That seems to be happening a lot. No, he said quietly. I mean it. Something in his voice made me pause. Then maybe you should start paying attention before you decide who people are. I stepped toward the door, but Ethan spoke again. Claire. I turned. He looked at me for a long moment. I thought I knew you. I gave him a small smile. That was your second mistake tonight. Then I walked out into the Manhattan night, leaving him behind in the warm golden light. I did not know it yet, but by the next morning, Ethan Blackwood would be staring at a file on his desk, and my name would be written across the top of it. The next morning, I arrived at the office at 8:15, exactly on time, carrying a coffee I had no intention of finishing. I had slept badly, not because of Ethan. At least, that was what I kept telling myself. The problem was that once you spent an evening showing someone exactly who you were, going back to pretending nothing had happened felt strangely impossible. I stepped out of the elevator and immediately noticed something was different. The usual rhythm of the executive floor was gone. No phones ringing. No assistants rushing between offices. Even the receptionist looked nervous. Good morning, I said. She looked at me as if I had asked whether the building was on fire. Mr. Blackwood wants to see you. I glanced at the clock. 8:17. Did he say why? No, of course he did not. I placed my bag on my desk, straightened the stack of meeting schedules I had prepared the night before, and walked toward his office. Ethan's door was already open. That was unusual. He preferred closed doors. Closed doors gave people time to wonder what waited behind them. I knocked anyway. Come in. His voice was calm. Too calm. I stepped inside and stopped. A file sat in the center of his desk. My file. Not my employment file. This one was older. Thicker. My name was printed across the front in black letters. Claire Bennett. I looked at Ethan. Should I be concerned? He leaned back in his chair. That depends. On what? On why you never told me you worked for the Bennett Foundation. For 1 second, I forgot how to breathe. Then I walked toward the desk and looked at the file again. You investigated me. I reviewed information available through our internal records. That sounds much nicer. His jaw tightened. Claire, do not. My voice surprised both of us. Do not say my name like that makes this acceptable. He stood slowly. The office suddenly felt smaller. After last night, I wanted to understand something. What? Why someone with your background has spent 3 years managing my calendar? I laughed once. There was no humor in it. And you thought the answer was hidden in a file? I thought you deserved to be taken seriously. You had 3 years to do that. Silence. I looked toward the windows. Manhattan stretched below us, gray and silver beneath the morning clouds. Tiny cars moved through the streets. People hurried beneath umbrellas. From 30 stories up, everyone looked equally small. My mother worked for the Bennett Foundation, I said finally. I did not. Ethan remained quiet. She spent 20 years building financial literacy programs for families who were already one emergency away from losing everything. After she died, I helped organize the records. That is where I learned what numbers can hide. I turned back toward him. I studied finance for 2 years. Then life changed. Tuition became impossible. Bills did not care about my grades. So I took the first stable job I could find. Ethan's expression softened, but I did not need his sympathy. And before you say anything, no, I am not secretly waiting for someone to rescue me. I chose this job because I needed it. Then I stayed because I was good at it. I know that now, he said. No. I picked up the file and held it between us. You know what a search told you? That is not the same thing. His eyes stayed on mine. For once, Ethan Blackwood did not have an answer ready. I set the file back on his desk. If you want to know something about me, ask. All right. His voice was quieter. Why did you stay? I looked at him for a long moment. That was the first honest question he had asked me since I walked into Belladonna. Because I was waiting for the right opportunity. And what does that look like? I reached into my bag and pulled out a folder. Actually, I think I found it. Ethan looked down. The folder contained a report I had been studying for 6 weeks. A small discrepancy in one of the company's older investment portfolios. Nothing dramatic. Just a number that appeared twice where it should have appeared once. But when I followed the pattern, it led somewhere neither of us expected. Ethan opened the report. His expression changed. Where did you get this? I pointed to the last page. From your company. He looked at the numbers again. Then at me. Claire. I stepped back toward the door. This time, Mr. Blackwood, maybe you should start by reading before you decide what the story is. I turned to leave, but his voice stopped me. Stay. I looked over my shoulder. He was still staring at the report. That number, he said slowly, was supposed to be impossible. And suddenly, the file with my name on it was no longer the most interesting secret in the room. Impossible is usually just another word for something nobody bothered to check twice, I said, and Ethan looked at me as if I had just moved the floor beneath his feet. He closed the report slowly. Sit down. I crossed my arms. That sounded suspiciously like an order. For a second, I expected the old Ethan to appear. The man who assumed people would move because he had spoken. Instead, he leaned back and exhaled. Please sit down, Claire. That was new. I noticed. I sat. He opened the report again, turning to the page where I had marked the duplicate transaction. The discrepancy was small enough to disappear inside the kind of numbers Ethan Blackwood dealt with every day. 2 entries. Same amount. Same date. Different internal codes. But when I traced the codes backward, they connected to an investment portfolio that had been closed nearly 5 years earlier. This should have been removed during the consolidation, Ethan said. It was not, I replied. And neither was this. I pointed to another line. The account number changed, but the transfer pattern stayed the same. He studied it. You have been looking at this for 6 weeks. Mostly during lunch. Sometimes after work. Why did you not bring it to me sooner? I looked at him. Because yesterday morning, you thought inviting me to dinner would be entertaining. His eyes lifted from the paper. Fair. I almost smiled. Almost. The strange thing about Ethan was that when he finally stopped defending himself, he became harder to dismiss. He pressed a button on his desk, then paused before speaking. Cancel my 10 o'clock. A voice answered through the speaker. You have the Morgan meeting at 10. Then cancel the Morgan meeting. The line went silent for half a second. I raised an eyebrow. Are you sure? You want to disappoint someone important? I am sitting across from someone important. The words landed between us. I looked away first. Outside, the clouds had begun to break apart, and a narrow line of sunlight moved across the glass towers downtown. I hated that I noticed it. I hated even more that I noticed the change in his voice. Do not make this weird, I said. I am trying not to. You are failing. That made him smile. It was a small smile. Real enough that I almost forgot who he was. Almost. For the next hour, we went through every page together. Not secretary and boss. Not the powerful man and the woman he had underestimated. Just two people following numbers through a maze of reports. Ethan asked questions. Actual questions. When I explained something, he listened. When he disagreed, he told me why. And when I proved him wrong, he did not pretend otherwise. By 11:30, I had circled 3 more transactions. Ethan stared at the page. These all connect to the same quarter. Yes. The quarter we acquired Bennett Capital. My hand stopped. The room became very quiet. What did you say? He looked up. Bennett Capital. Small advisory firm. The acquisition happened before you started here. I shook my head slowly. My mother used to mention that company. Your mother? She consulted for them near the end of her career. Ethan reached for another file from the side of his desk. Claire, I did not know that. Neither did I. He opened the older file, but before he could turn the first page, I stood. Wait. Something was wrong. Not with the numbers. With the timing. My mother had started working with Bennett Capital less than a year before she died. I remembered late nights at our kitchen table. Stacks of papers. Her reading glasses. The way she would close a folder whenever I walked into the room. At the time, I had assumed it was ordinary work. Now, 5 years later, Ethan's company was sitting in front of me, connected to the same name. Claire, he said carefully. What are you thinking? I stared at the file. I think my mother knew something. Ethan said nothing. I looked at him. And I think whatever she knew ended up inside this company. The smile disappeared from his face. He understood before I finished speaking. This was no longer a curious accounting error. It was personal. Ethan closed the file and stood. We will find out. I held his gaze. No, his expression tightened. No. We will find out. The difference mattered. I saw him understand it. Slowly, Ethan nodded. All right. Then he moved the chair beside his desk toward the table and placed the files between us. Where do we start? I looked down at the oldest document. My mother's initials were written in faded blue ink near the bottom of the page. For years, I had believed that was nothing more than a memory. That morning, it became the first clue. And somewhere inside Ethan Blackwood's empire, a story had been waiting for me to notice it. For the next 3 days, Ethan and I became careful around each other. Not distant. Careful. There was a difference. Distance meant pretending nothing had changed. Careful meant we both knew everything had. Every morning, I arrived at 8:15 and found a new stack of documents waiting on the conference table beside his office. Every afternoon, we followed another line of numbers into another closed account, another old report, another name that had disappeared from the company years before I ever walked through its doors. And somewhere between those pages, I began to see a version of Ethan Blackwood that had never existed in the stories people whispered about him. He worked too much. He drank coffee that had been sitting on his desk for hours. He had an irritating habit of reading a paragraph twice when something bothered him. And when he was genuinely concentrating, he forgot that anyone else was in the room. That last part became important on Thursday evening. It was nearly 7 o'clock. Most of the office was dark. The city outside had turned blue, then black, with thousands of windows glowing across Manhattan. I was standing beside the conference table, comparing 2 sets of records, when Ethan suddenly said, "You should go home." I did not look up. You have said that 3 times. Because it is 7 o'clock. I can read a clock. Claire. Ethan. He stared at me. I kept reading. Finally, he smiled despite himself. You are impossible. That is interesting coming from you. The smile disappeared when I placed my finger on a line near the bottom of the page. Wait. Ethan came around the table. Not too close. Just close enough to see what I was pointing at. The transaction was ordinary at first glance. A consulting payment made 5 years ago, 2 months before my mother died. But the recipient was not Bennett Capital. It was a smaller company I had never heard of. Marlowe Consulting. Do you know them? I asked. Ethan shook his head. Not personally, but I know the name. He walked to his desk and opened a drawer. After a moment, he returned with a thin folder. His expression had changed. Marlowe Consulting handled part of the Bennett Capital transition. I looked at the papers. Then why were they paid after the acquisition was complete? They should not have been. The room went still. I traced the date with my fingertip. April 17th. I knew that date. I remembered it because my mother had come home late that night. She had stood in our kitchen without turning on the lights. I had been 23 and still believed that asking enough questions could solve anything. Mom, I had called. She had looked at me for a long time before saying, "If you ever see something that does not make sense, do not ignore it just because someone important tells you to." I had forgotten those words until that moment. Or maybe I had spent years pretending I had. "Claire," Ethan's voice brought me back. I realized I was holding the edge of the table too tightly. "She knew," I whispered. "My mother knew something was wrong." Ethan looked at the records. "We do not know that yet." I turned toward him. "You just told me this payment should not exist." "I know." His voice softened. "But I do not want you to build a conclusion before we have proof." For once, I did not argue. Because he was right. And I hated that he was right. I sat down slowly. Ethan remained standing across from me, his hands resting on the back of a chair. "There is something else," he said. "I found Marlowe's old contact records." I looked up, and the company had one senior consultant assigned to the transition. He slid the paper toward me. I read the name once. Then again. My stomach tightened. Daniel Blackwood. I looked at Ethan. He did not look away. "My father," he said. The rain began against the windows again, soft at first, then harder. Neither of us spoke. For years, I had imagined the people behind powerful companies as strangers with distant names. Now my mother's initials sat beside records connected to Ethan's father. The past had become smaller, more personal, more dangerous in the emotional sense, because suddenly every answer had the power to change what we believed about the people we loved. "Did you know?" I asked. "No." "Did your father ever mention Bennett Capital?" "Never." I studied his face, searching for the certainty I had once assumed belonged to him. It was gone. In its place was the same thing I felt. Doubt. "Then we find the truth," I said. Ethan nodded slowly. "Together." This time, I did not correct him. But as he reached for the next file, a thought moved quietly through my mind. My mother had taught me that numbers remembered what people tried to forget. And now, buried inside Ethan Blackwood's empire, the numbers were beginning to remember both of our families. The name stayed between us long after Ethan stopped speaking. Daniel Blackwood. His father. I looked at the paper again, as if the letters might rearrange themselves into something less complicated. They did not. "What happens now?" I asked. Ethan walked to the window. Below us, Manhattan moved through the rain without caring that two people 30 floors above the street had just discovered their families might share a secret. "Now we stop guessing," he said, "and we find someone who can explain the records." I gathered the documents. Marlowe Consulting has been closed for years. The company has been closed. He turned toward me. That does not mean every person disappeared. By 9 the next morning, we had a name. Margaret Ellis, former financial controller for Marlowe Consulting, 72 years old, retired, living less than 50 miles outside the city. Ethan wanted to send someone to contact her. I refused immediately. "Absolutely not." He looked up from his phone. "Why?" "Because this concerns my mother and your father. I am not sending a stranger to knock on her door with a list of questions. Claire, you cannot simply drive to a retired woman's house and expect her to tell you everything." I was not planning to simply drive there. He waited. I was planning to ask politely. His mouth almost moved into a smile. "Terrifying strategy. It has worked surprisingly well for 28 years. We left Manhattan late that morning. Not in one of Ethan's polished black cars with tinted windows. I refused that too. Instead, we took my old silver sedan, which made him look personally offended before he even closed the passenger door. "You drive this?" he asked. "Every day." "The seat is too low. You are too tall. The air conditioning sounds unhealthy." "That is because it is working." He looked at me. I started the engine. "You are welcome to walk." 20 minutes later, he was still in the passenger seat. The city slowly disappeared behind us. Buildings became highways. Highways became quieter roads lined with wet trees and old fences. For nearly an hour, neither of us mentioned Daniel Blackwood or my mother. We talked about smaller things instead. My car. His inability to sit still without checking his phone. The fact that he had never eaten gas station potato chips. That cannot be true, I said. It is. You have lived 36 years and never had gas station potato chips. I have eaten potatoes. That is not the same experience. He gave me a look. 10 minutes later, I pulled into a gas station. He stared at the shelves as if he had entered a foreign country. Watching Ethan Blackwood choose between barbecue and sour cream flavor was probably the strangest thing I had seen all week. Which one, he asked. You are asking me? Apparently, you are the expert. I smiled. Barbecue. He bought both. By the time we reached Margaret Ellis's house, the rain had stopped. Her home was small and white, with a blue front door and flower pots lined neatly beneath the windows. I suddenly felt nervous. Not because I expected danger, because sometimes the truth was more frightening when it arrived quietly. I knocked. A few seconds passed. Then the door opened. Margaret Ellis looked exactly like someone who had spent her life keeping secrets. Her gray hair was pinned neatly behind her head. Her eyes were sharp. They moved from me to Ethan and stopped. Blackwood, she said. Ethan straightened. You knew my father. I knew your father. Her gaze moved to me. And you must be Claire. Every thought in my head disappeared. How do you know my name? Margaret did not answer immediately. Instead, she opened the door wider. Because your mother asked me to remember it. Ethan and I looked at each other. For the first time since we started this search, neither of us had a clever response. We followed Margaret inside. Her living room smelled faintly of coffee and old books. She walked to a wooden cabinet and removed a small box from the bottom drawer. Then she placed it on the table between us. Your mother came to see me 5 years ago, she said. My hands went cold. Before she died? Margaret nodded. 2 weeks before. Ethan looked toward me, but I could not meet his eyes. I was staring at the box. What did she say? My voice barely sounded like mine. Margaret rested her hand on the lid. She said that if anything happened to her, one day you would come looking for answers. The room became completely silent. Then Margaret looked directly at Ethan. But she also said you would not come alone. I finally looked at him. Ethan was already watching me. Outside, a bird landed on the wet windowsill and disappeared again. Inside, neither of us moved. My mother had known. Somehow, years before I ever worked for Ethan Blackwood, before he ever noticed me, before that ridiculous dinner invitation changed the direction of everything, she had known our paths would cross. Margaret opened the box. Inside was an envelope with my name written across the front in my mother's handwriting. I reached for it, but my fingers stopped an inch away. Some doors only open once. And I suddenly understood that whatever waited inside could change not only the story of my mother, but the story of Ethan and me as well. My mother had always believed that some truths should be read alone. I knew that because the envelope in front of me had my name on it, and nothing else. No warning. No explanation. Just Claire, written in the familiar slant of her handwriting. For several seconds, I could not touch it. Margaret sat quietly across from me. Ethan stood beside the window, giving me space without being asked. Somehow, that made it harder. I finally picked up the envelope and opened it carefully. The paper inside had been folded twice. My hands shook as I read the first line. Claire, if you are holding this, then I am sorry I left you with questions I should have answered myself. I stopped breathing. The next words blurred before I forced myself to continue. My mother wrote that she had discovered irregular financial transfers connected to Bennett Capital during the transition to Ethan's family company. She had followed the records because she believed the discrepancies were being hidden inside legitimate transactions. But then the letter changed. Daniel Blackwood was not the person she suspected. I read that sentence 3 times. Ethan turned from the window. What is it? I looked up at him. My mother says your father tried to help her. His face went completely still. Margaret nodded slowly. That is true. I looked back at the letter. Daniel had discovered the same pattern my mother had found. According to her, they had worked separately at first, each believing the other might be responsible. Then they realized someone else had been using the transition between companies to move money through temporary consulting accounts. Marlowe Consulting had been one of them. Who? Ethan asked. I kept reading. My mother never wrote a name. Instead, she wrote that Daniel had discovered evidence pointing towards someone inside the executive group who had benefited from the confusion after the acquisition. He had promised to take the information to the board. Then, suddenly, everything stopped. The records vanished. My mother left the investigation. Daniel stopped talking about Bennett Capital completely. Why would he do that? Ethan asked. There was something different in his voice now. Not anger. Pain. The kind that arrived when the person you thought you knew became a stranger. Margaret rose slowly and walked to a bookshelf. From behind several old binders, she removed a second envelope. This one was smaller. Because Daniel had a son, she said. Ethan looked at it, but did not move. And my mother had a daughter, I whispered. Margaret's eyes softened. They both believe that some battles become more dangerous when innocent people are standing behind you. I hated the word innocent. It made me feel like a child. But I understood what she meant. My mother had not given up because she was weak. She had chosen me over a fight she could not predict. Ethan finally stepped toward the table. What happened to the evidence? Margaret placed the second envelope beside mine. Your father kept copies. Ethan looked down at his name written in faded ink. For the first time since I had known him, he looked uncertain about opening something. I understood that feeling, so I did not tell him to hurry. I simply waited. Finally, he opened it. Inside was a single photograph and a handwritten note. The photograph showed my mother and Daniel standing outside an office building. They were younger than I remembered my mother being. They were both smiling. Not because everything was fine. Because perhaps, for one brief moment, they believed they had found someone who understood the truth. Ethan read the note silently. Then he handed it to me. It contained only one sentence. If Claire ever finds this, tell her that her mother was right. I looked at Ethan. His eyes met mine. My father knew your name, he said. I nodded. Apparently, our parents knew more about each other than we ever knew. Margaret sat back down. There is one more thing. Neither of us spoke. Your mother did not leave the investigation behind completely. She trusted someone with the original records. I leaned forward. Who? Margaret looked at me. Then at Ethan. Someone who still works in your company. The drive back to Manhattan was quieter than the drive out. Ethan sat beside me with the photograph resting carefully inside its envelope. I kept one hand on the steering wheel and the other near the letter. We had answers now, just not enough of them. After nearly an hour, Ethan spoke. Claire. Yes. I owe you an apology. I glanced at him. For which part? He almost smiled, but it disappeared quickly. For all of it. The dinner. The assumptions. The file. Rain began tapping softly against the windshield. I kept my eyes on the road. You cannot fix 3 years with one apology. I know. His voice was quiet. I am not asking you to forgive me. That surprised me. Then why say it? He looked out the window. Because you deserve to hear it anyway. I did not answer immediately. Sometimes an apology did not change the past. Sometimes it simply changed what came next. When we reached Manhattan, I parked outside the building and turned off the engine. Ethan reached for the door, then stopped. Claire, there is something you should know before we go upstairs. I looked at him. He was staring toward the glowing tower where his company waited above the city. My father did not build this empire alone. My stomach tightened. Who helped him? Ethan looked back at me. The man who became my mentor. His expression hardened with a realization I could almost see forming. And he still has an office on the executive floor. I looked toward the building. Somewhere 30 floors above the street, someone had been watching the same company records we had uncovered. And for the first time, I wondered whether our search had truly begun 5 years ago, or whether someone had been waiting all along for Claire Bennett and Ethan Blackwood to finally start asking the right questions. The executive floor was almost empty when Ethan and I returned, but the lights in one office were still on. I knew exactly which office he meant before he said the name. Walter Grayson, 71 years old. Vice chairman. Ethan's mentor since he was barely out of college. The man whose photograph hung beside Ethan's father in the lobby of the original Blackwood building. You think he is involved? I asked quietly. Ethan loosened his tie but did not look away from the closed office door at the end of the hall. I think I have spent my entire adult life believing Walter was the one person in this company who would never lie to me. Something in his voice made me understand that this was not only about money or old records anymore. Trust was a structure too, and when one part of it cracked, everything above it began to shift. Then do not accuse him, I said. Ethan looked at me. I was not planning to. Good. I held up the envelope containing my mother's letter. We have spent 5 years' worth of mistakes catching up with us. I would rather not add a new one. For a moment, he said nothing. Then he nodded. You are right. We walked toward Walter's office together. The door was open. Walter sat behind his desk, reading something beneath the warm yellow light of a small lamp. He looked up when we entered. His expression changed when he saw both of us. Then his eyes dropped to the envelope in my hand. Only for a second, but I saw it. So did Ethan. You are working late, Ethan said. Walter leaned back. So are you. We found some old records. Walter's face remained calm. That company has decades of old records. Ethan stepped farther into the room. I stayed beside him, not behind him. Walter noticed that too. Marlowe Consulting, Ethan said. The silence that followed was quiet enough to hear the air conditioner turn on. Walter slowly removed his glasses. I have not heard that name in years. You knew them? I asked. His eyes moved to me. I knew of them. My mother worked with Bennett Capital, I said. Her name was Eleanor Bennett. Walter's fingers tightened around his glasses. There it was again. Not surprise. Recognition. My heartbeat changed. You remember her, I said. Yes. His voice was lower now. Ethan looked at him. Why did you never tell me? Walter stood and walked toward the window. Because your father made it clear that the matter was finished. Ethan frowned. My father. Daniel believed that continuing the investigation would destroy more than one company. He believed people would be hurt. I stepped forward. My mother believed that too. But neither of them destroyed the records. Walter turned around slowly. No, I held up the envelope. Then who did? For the first time, Walter looked tired. Not old. Tired. Like a man who had been carrying the same weight for too long. He returned to his desk and opened the bottom drawer. From inside, he removed a thin leather folder. Ethan stared at it. You kept them. Walter placed the folder on the desk. Daniel asked me to. My mind raced through every possibility. Then why hide them? Walter looked at me. Because the person responsible was not an outsider. Ethan's expression hardened. Who was it? Walter did not answer. Instead, he opened the folder and slid one document toward us. I recognized the transfer codes immediately. The same pattern. The same duplicate structure. But this time, there was a signature authorization at the bottom. Ethan looked down. Then his face went completely still. No, he whispered. I leaned closer. The name was not Walter Grayson. It was Daniel Blackwood. I looked at Ethan. What does that mean? He did not answer. Walter did. It means your father knew more than either of you were told. The room seemed to narrow around us. For a second, I could not decide which possibility hurt more. That Daniel had helped hide the truth. Or that Ethan had spent his life trusting a version of his father that might not exist. That signature could have been forged, I said. Walter nodded slowly. It could have. Ethan finally looked up. But you do not believe it was. Walter said nothing. And somehow, his silence answered everything. I turned toward Ethan, expecting anger, disbelief, anything. Instead, he looked exhausted. He stared at the signature as though it belonged to a stranger. There is one way to know, I said. Ethan looked at me. How? I tapped the document. Find out what happened after he signed it. Walter's eyes sharpened. Claire, that information was never entered into the company archives. I looked toward the dark windows, where Manhattan reflected back at us like another world. Then it was entered somewhere else. Ethan watched me think. I could feel him beginning to understand. My mother, I said slowly. She kept copies of everything important at home. Walter frowned. Her home was cleared years ago. Not by me. The words came out before I could stop them. I had not been able to return to my mother's old house since selling it after her death. But one thing had never been sold. A small storage unit 10 miles outside the city, rented under my name because my mother had once told me that everyone needed one place where the past could wait without being destroyed. Ethan stepped closer. Claire, you do not have to do this tonight. I looked at him. Yes, I do. He searched my face. Then, quietly, he nodded. Walter watched us from behind his desk. If you find what I think you will find, you may wish you had left this alone. I picked up my mother's envelope. That seems to be the problem with everyone in this story. They kept leaving things alone. Ethan reached for his coat. I picked up my bag. As we walked toward the elevator, neither of us spoke. Then the doors opened, and I stepped inside. Ethan followed. Just before the elevator closed, I looked back down the empty executive floor and felt a strange certainty settle inside me. The truth had been buried for years. But buried did not mean gone. Sometimes it only meant that someone had been waiting long enough to finally dig with their own hands. The storage unit smelled like dust, cardboard, and old winters. I had not been there in 5 years. The overhead light flickered once before settling into a pale yellow glow, and suddenly I was standing in the middle of everything I had spent years avoiding. My mother's old desk, 3 sealed boxes, a lamp with a cracked green shade. Ethan stopped beside me, but said nothing. That was the kindest thing he could have done. "She kept all this?" he finally asked. I nodded. My mother believed throwing something away was a decision you could regret later. I walked to the desk. My hands moved automatically, opening drawers I remembered from another life. Pens, receipts, old notebooks. Nothing useful. At least, nothing obvious. Ethan checked the boxes while I searched beneath the desk. "Claire," he said quietly. I turned. He was holding a small metal cash box. My breath caught. I had forgotten it existed. My mother used to keep it on the highest shelf in her closet, far above where I could reach as a child. I took it from him. The key was taped beneath the bottom. Of course it was. I laughed softly, and the sound broke in the middle. Ethan did not pretend not to notice. Inside the box were documents wrapped in a blue folder, a photograph, and a sealed envelope addressed to Eleanor's daughter. I opened the folder first. The original records were there. Every transaction, every duplicate code, every name connected to Marlowe Consulting. And finally, the missing page that explained everything. Daniel Blackwood had signed the authorization, but not to approve the hidden transfers. He had signed an internal hold order that froze the accounts while he prepared evidence for the board. The signature had been copied onto another document afterward. I read it twice. Then a third time. Ethan stood completely still. "My father was trying to stop it," he said. "Yes." My voice trembled. He was. The relief in his face was almost painful to watch. But the documents contained one more truth. The person who had altered the authorization and continued the transfers was not Walter Grayson. It was Richard Vail, the former chief financial officer who had resigned shortly before Daniel's death and quietly transferred his remaining interests years later. Walter had kept Daniel's records because he had promised to protect them until someone could prove what they meant. My mother had known Daniel was innocent. That was why she had written the letter. She had trusted Margaret. She had trusted Walter. And somehow, she had believed that one day I would find the rest. Ethan sat down on the edge of an old chair. For a moment, he looked less like the man who controlled half the city and more like a son who had just been given his father back. "All these years," he said, "I thought he walked away from it." I sat beside him. Maybe he did not walk away. Ethan looked at me. Maybe he was waiting for the truth to survive him. Silence filled the storage unit. Not the uncomfortable kind. The kind that arrives after a storm, when nothing is fixed yet, but you can finally see where the ground begins. I opened the final envelope. Inside was one page. My mother had written that she was proud of me, even though she had no way of knowing who I would become. She told me not to confuse being underestimated with being powerless. Then, at the bottom, she had written one sentence that made my eyes fill before I could stop them. "The right people will not ask you to become smaller so they can feel taller." Ethan read the words over my shoulder. Neither of us spoke for a long time. Then he stood. "What happens now?" I folded the letter carefully. "We give these documents to the board, the auditors, and the proper investigators. We let the truth become official." He nodded. "And after that," I looked around the storage unit. 5 years of silence. 1 lifetime of memories. Then I looked at him. "After that, I stopped being your secretary." His expression changed immediately. "Claire, I mean it." "I know." He took a breath. "What do you want?" It was the first time Ethan Blackwood had asked me that question without expecting the answer to fit inside his world. I smiled. "A position in strategic analysis. Equal authority over my work. No special treatment because you feel guilty, and no one decides what I am capable of before I speak." His eyes held mine. "Done. You did not even negotiate. I have learned that underestimating you is expensive." I laughed. This time, it came easily. We left the storage unit just before sunrise. The rain had stopped, and Manhattan was beginning to glow in the distance. At the office later that morning, Ethan handed the evidence to the people responsible for reviewing it. Walter was cleared of suspicion. The investigation into the old financial misconduct was reopened. Richard Vail's name became part of the official inquiry, exactly as it should have been years earlier. I watched the process begin from the conference room window, but for the first time, I did not feel like a secretary standing outside someone else's future. Ethan joined me. "You know," he said, "I invited you to dinner because I thought I knew what would happen." I looked at him. That was a terrible prediction. The worst one I ever made. I smiled. He looked toward the city, then back at me. Would you have dinner with me again? I considered him for a moment. Is this another joke? No. Are you inviting me because you finally know who I am? He shook his head. No. I am inviting you because I know I still have a lot to learn. The morning light touched the windows behind him. I thought about my mother's letter. About all the years people had mistaken silence for weakness. Then I picked up my new folder from the table. Thursday, I said. Ethan smiled. Thursday. And as I walked out of the room, I understood something my mother had known long before I did. Some people enter your life believing they have the power to define you. The right ones stay long enough to realize you were never waiting to be defined at all.